Er zijn 3 dingen in het leven van een kunstenaar. Ten eerste, te kunnen werken. Ten tweede, goed te kunnen werken. En ten derde, de grootst mogelijke weerklank bij zijn publiek te vinden.
Who's afraid of art? Tyrants and wannabe tyrants, so it seems.
Artist Alexandra Skochelenko has been sentenced to 7 years in prison by St. Petersburg's invasion, spreading false information, disinformation.
With autocracy growing, with tyrants on the roll, Balie brings together over 40 international artists, writers and thinkers during Forum on European Culture. We celebrate the subversive power of art and literature and curate works of opposition that preserve the histories autocrats want to erase and imagine the futures they fear.
So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Art against the tyrants. Not for the faint-hearted.
So good morning, or maybe good afternoon, depends on how you look at it, but very welcome to the Forum on European Culture, Art Against the Tyrants, and I'm delighted to see that you're all here on this early morning to join in conversation on Ukraine's past, present and future, as we announced this panel in our forum. My name is Yuri Albrecht, I'm the director of the Balie, and I will conduct this conversation. I'm sitting before a canvas made by the Crimean artist Nikita Kravtsov. I think he's sitting over there. Yes, he is. Who's working also in the Pleinzaal, the other hall, not too next to the entrance, on a big work of art. And the texts on the artwork behind me are written by refugees. And after the program, you can read them if you want, and if you consider yourself a refugee, you can also join in writing on the piece of art. We thought it fitting to ask a Crimean artist to paint a painting here, especially if we have speakers on Ukraine's present and future, like Anne Applebaum and Volodymyr Yermolenko, and I'm delighted you're both here and able to make it, even traveling also from the war-torn Ukraine. Very warm welcome to you both. Anne Applebaum, a historian and writer specializing in Eastern European and Soviet history, written many award-winning books, including quite recently, Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World, and I have to admit that this book is very much at the heart of the inspiration for us to make this program. So we're delighted to have you here, and yesterday evening as well. She wrote many books, award-winning books, such as Gulag, A History. She won the Pulitzer Prize, and she's a staff writer of The Atlantic and a senior fellow at AGORA Institute at Johns Hopkins University. Volodymyr Yermolenko, a Ukrainian philosopher, writer, and journalist. He's the editor-in-chief of Ukraine World, a multimedia platform. He makes an amazing podcast, Thinking in Dark Times, which I think is a very fitting title, and I can really recommend that to you. Also a prolific writer. Some of his books, actually also the books of Anne Applebaum, are published in Dutch, but some of Volodymyr Yermolenko's books as well, among them Ukraine, Geschiedenis en Verhalen is one of them. Current president of the PEN Ukraine, and he's been a powerful, I have to say, a powerful voice for Ukraine during this ongoing war of 3 years. So, very happy that you're both here, like I said. But before we start, I'd like to give the floor to a very special guest also here, Andrey Kurkov, for an introduction. He will read a short fragment of his diary of an invasion, which he started writing after the full-scale invasion. Andrey Kurkov is one of Ukraine's greatest writers. His novels, including Death and the Penguin, Grey Beast, The Silver Bone, they have been translated in more than 40 languages. He's a keen observer of post-Soviet societies, blending satire, political commentary, and deeply human storytelling. I'm very, very glad that you're here, Mr. Kurkov, and the floor is yours. Give him a warm applause.
Thank you very much, and I want just to say first that I'm so happy to see so many people in this hall who came to attend, to listen to one of the most important conversations of this event, and I want to express my gratitude to the Balie Festival, because I don't know another festival where literature and politics are so well blended. And I will read two short extracts written on the 16th of June 2022, which is like 4 months into the full-scale invasion. Please don't forget that the war started actually in 2014, because still people are talking about 3 years of the war. It's more than 11 years of the war now. The war in Ukraine has entered a protracted, slow-paced phase. Europe has now become accustomed to it, although the USA has not. In the USA, they understand that getting used to war is extremely dangerous. Together with the UK, Norway, Lithuania, and Poland, they are actively helping Ukraine with weapons. They see this as the way to get Russia to agree to negotiate sooner rather than later. Germany, France, and Italy, on the other hand, are afraid to strengthen Ukraine in this war. They calculate that by slowing down the supply of weapons or even refusing to help Ukraine with heavy weapons, they will hasten the end of the war. They seem to think that when Russia has occupied all the territories it planned to take over, then it will cease aggression and call Ukraine to the negotiating table, putting a fait accompli before the Ukrainian leadership. In such a situation, the message from Russia would be recognize the annexation of the occupied territories, or we will annex more. Russia has its own plan. This includes the destruction of the entire state of Ukraine. Its plan was announced in an article titled "What Russia Should Do with Ukraine" by Russian political strategist Timofey Sergeyevtsev and published by the state-controlled Russian news agency RIA Novosti on April 3rd this year, 5 weeks after the new Russian aggression began. In the 4th month of the full-scale war, maintaining a fighting spirit in Ukrainian society is not as easy as at the beginning of hostilities. The pressure from the Russian forces at the front is relentless. They have 15 to 20 times more artillery than the Ukrainian side, and more soldiers too. Despite this, there have been no drastic changes to the shape of the front line in the south or east. On the Western Front, that is, in the war of narratives within Europe, Ukraine has already defeated Russia. Ukrainian flags hang in the centers of almost every European city or town. Sometimes the Ukrainian flag flies among the flags of the member states of the European Union. This especially pleases and inspires most Ukrainians, as it pleases me too. But I do see another meaning in this, which perhaps is not yet so obvious. There will come a moment when European leaders will say to Ukraine, "That's it, we can no longer help you. Agree to the Russian annexation of the south and east of the country, and in return we will accept what remains of Ukraine into the European Union." In foreseeing this eventuality, the important question for Ukrainians is what will be left of Ukraine at this moment. Will Odessa remain? Will Kharkiv remain? European geopolitics is the art of elegant cynicism, although many will not see anything cynical in such a formulation. On the contrary, they will say, "You see, the European Union did save you from Russia." It is probably too early to think about such a scenario, especially if the USA and the UK are still not tired of helping Ukraine. After 3 months of war, however, even President Biden could not restrain himself from recalling publicly how he had warned President Zelensky about the certainty of Russia's attack and how the Ukrainian president had not wanted to listen to him. Nonetheless, according to Time magazine, Zelensky is now one of the most influential people in the world, together, of course, with President Biden. Ukraine is now also much more than just a well-known country. There can be few adults in the world who do not know where Ukraine is located and with whom it is at war. Thank you very much. Thank you. You see what changed in the last 3 years and what remained unchanged. And actually, Ukrainian spirit remained unchanged. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrey Kurkov. And there'll be more possibility to listen to Andrey Kurkov in this weekend, on Saturday and Sunday as well. Maybe starting off with what we just heard, and you're just arriving from Kiev. I was wondering, well, first of all, I was wondering personally, for you to travel from a city which is again, intensely bombed, to how are you? And then coming to a city like Amsterdam, and
Thank you for asking. Well, this is one of the questions to which it's very difficult to respond, actually.
I understand.
But I'm very thankful to all of you and for this invitation. And this is really, it's very important to keep this topic alive and to talk about Ukraine in the broader context. But not only I'm coming from Kiev, we are traveling a lot on the frontline zones, and recently I've been to Kherson, which is 5 kilometers from the Russian troops. And
5?
Yes.
5.
5, 6,
It's across the river.
It's across the river, the Dnipro River. And a few days ago we were in Dnipro, and you've probably heard in the news a big attack on Dnipro with several dozens of killed and hundreds of wounded. So basically we left Dnipro just 1 hour before the shelling started. The first times when I was going to Western Europe after the start of the full-scale invasion, I felt myself like in a matrix. I remember being in a Paris metro and saying myself, this is so beautiful and so unreal compared to the reality of war. I think that one of the things that Russia is fighting against is actually reality. It's the very material and physical reality of human beings and human suffering, and therefore they all try to persuade ourselves that the virtual world they invented is more real than the reality itself. And I think we had a recent conversation with Anne. We have several conversations, actually. We have a practice of talking with each other. And I suggested to Anne this idea that basically this is what Trump tries to learn from Putin, is the idea that you can invent a virtual world, a world of fantasy that will try to beat the reality. But I think Ukrainians are very, 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 intimate with the reality of human bodies, with the reality of cities, with the reality of our physical life, with the reality of mortality. Because reality comes through death. Well, it's very tragic, but at the same time very, very humane, because we are all mortal, and as soon as we understand how fragile we are, we can have empathy with others. And I think Ukraine is now the place where you have very, very great amount of pain, but also very great amount of joy, very great amount of tragedy, but also very great amount of happiness. It's as paradoxical as it is.
Yeah, let's recover from from that statement. Wonderful statement, maybe. And isn't that isn't that also very? It's hopeful, of course, that you can pour something as beautiful out of such terrible wars as you just described. Is that something? The fact that you came across that sort of insider feelings, is that that's partly, of course, because you lived through a war. Is that something we totally lack in Western Europe or in America because we don't have these experiences?
I don't think it's about liking. I think it's about understanding that, well, dark times also produce a lot of light. And this is why, for example, I love so much the Dutch paintings of 17th century. All this play with the darkness and light. People like Rembrandt, or people like Van Honthorst, or French painting of the time, or Caravaggio, the Italian painting of the time. So the idea that basically, if you start from the dark, if you start the painting from the dark, it's probably your only chance to see the real light. And we recently got a gift with my wife from our friend, a soldier who lost his hand during the battlefield in 2023. His name is Bogdan. He's an incredible person. And he made us a gift with the inscription, the darker the times, the brighter the people. So I think that's very, very important. I have this chiaroscuro metaphor as a metaphor of thinking, so that you can only see the light through and despite the darkness. And it's always been, it's not only about Ukraine, it's about humanity, it's about the human culture. Like, I'm always saying that, look, Renaissance was able only after the big darkness of the plague of the 14th century, or you can say that avant-garde art in Europe was possible after the tragedies of the First World War. Mm-hmm. And you can go on and go on. It's like what Baudelaire called the les fleurs du mal. So you have this pain and tragedy, but out of this you can get flowers, you can get beauty, you can get empathy, you can get the real sense of humanity.
Although there is a difference between people who have experienced a war and lived in it and people who haven't, I think. And there's a famous passage from the writer Czesław Miłosz. There's a Polish Nobel Prize winner and novelist, and he, in one of his books, he has an excerpt where he says how weird it was, because he actually he went outside immediately after the war. He left Poland. He was briefly collaborated with the Communist Party and worked in a foreign embassy. And he talks about the strangeness of it. And one of the things he says was, you've just emerged from a world where it was normal for well-educated, middle-class teenagers to become cold-blooded killers because they were working for the Home Army. They were trying to kill Nazis. And you've seen how fast that transformation works, and where it became normal for people to do things that in real life you would never do. And then you come into a world where for people all that is still unimaginable. There is a kind of gap. And I'm afraid that there is still a gap in not all of Europe and not among all of Europeans, but among a lot of people. There's a gap of imagination. That we still feel like Ukraine is far away and it's not really connected to us. And is it a real country anyway? And we didn't really hear of it that much before. And is stuff happening there? Does it really affect us? And
so Volodymyr is actually being too nice for us.
He's being nice. Yes.
Yeah.
But there is the inability to imagine that things could be different is one of the curses of our otherwise very lucky civilization.
Sort of a lack of empathy or possibility to move into the other.
It's also, we have in Europe and America, we've been very lucky for a long time. And we've just lived through this period of actual incredible prosperity and freedom, of a kind that's pretty unique in world history, even. If you look back, and most of humanity and most of history has been ruled by what we would now call autocrats. Kings or warlords or empires, and we've just lived through a period of time when many people lived in something different, and we began to assume that was normal and treat it as normal. And we have forgotten that there are these other people who hate and dislike those systems, or who have other reasons to want to destroy them. And we can see that most obviously and graphically in Ukraine, but of course that manifests itself in other ways too.
Yeah, because you have described, to follow up on this, that the full-scale invasion was sort of the first real battle between Autocracy Inc. and democracy. Why would you say that? Why would that point be so important?
So by Autocracy Inc., what I describe in my book is a network of dictatorships, not all dictatorships, but who were particularly concerned by the language of liberal democracy, not just liberal democracy, but rights and rule of law and independent courts and transparency and accountability, because that language was often the language of their own oppositions. And it was the language that was most threatening to them and to their political systems. And this is where you have some unity between otherwise very disparate regimes like Russia, nationalist Russia, or communist China, or theocratic Iran, or Bolivarian socialist Venezuela. What they have in common is that they see this kind of language and these ideas as a threat to their systems, and they began to look for ways to push back against them. And of course, they did so at home. But they also began to look at how to do so internationally. And some of this we know. I mean, there was political party funding. In China is very focused on Taiwan, on undermining democracy in Taiwan, because the idea that there could be a successful Chinese democracy is threatening to Beijing. And Putin became very, very focused for that similar reason on Ukraine, because Ukraine is just close enough to Russia and has had a long. They've been part of the same empire. Russia was a colonial power in Ukraine for many centuries. And the idea that first during the original Orange Revolution in 2003 and 4, and then the Maidan Revolution in 2014, the idea that Ukraine could demand democracy, that there could be a street revolution where people carried signs calling for an end to corruption and would wave EU flags, the EU in Ukraine, of course, being a kind of symbol for rule of law and democracy. I know that it doesn't always have that symbolism in the EU, but it does outside the EU.
That's very good to notice.
Yeah, but this was literally, they were waving EU flags in the streets of Kiev in 2014. And Putin saw that, and what he perceived in part was a threat to himself. Because if this could happen in Kiev, then it could happen in Moscow.
Yeah, and that's not just theoretically, but practically.
But practically, and this is something that worried him. And the invasion of Ukraine was meant to demonstrate. First of all, it was meant to destroy this movement of which is both about. It's also about national sovereignty and identity, but it's also about this set of, as I said, liberal ideas. It's not just democracy. As I say, it's a little broader than that. It was meant to destroy that. And it was also meant to show, the purpose of the invasion was to show that the liberal world and the international order that it helped create after the Second World War, that it doesn't exist and it doesn't matter. And that Putin can invade a sovereign country, despite having signed the UN Charter, which explicitly forbids that. He can kidnap children, he can kill civilians, he can defy the laws of war, the Convention on Genocide, he can do all these things and nobody will stop him. And what he was trying to show was that these laws and this language and these rules don't work anymore. And that wasn't the only reason for the invasion. I think he also has an imperial, some kind of imperial aims as well. But that was an important goal.
Yeah, which is akin to the Chinese trying to undermine Taiwan for the same reason. A democracy next door sort of threatens your autocracy.
It threatens you. I mean, they understand that there is a war of ideas. We don't always see that. I mean, I don't think most people wake up in the morning in Amsterdam and think, I'm really worried about what's happening in Moscow this morning, or I'm terribly upset about what's happening in Beijing. But actually, there are people in Beijing and Moscow, as well as Caracas and, Tehran, who do wake up in the morning worried about us. So they care about us a lot and what we say and think, even though we don't spend a lot of time thinking about them, at least not until recently.
Would you agree, Volodymyr, on this sort of the idea that it is not only a war, not only a post-colonial or colonial war, which we will, but of also course. A battle of ideas, maybe even good against evil. Is that would? Would you agree, or is that?
So it's definitely not a war for territories. It's we've met with Yuri recently in Tbilisi, and Tbilisi is also one of the very important places, and they also have the EU flags there. So
yeah, that's
and
right.
it's also a question of life and death, because for having an EU flag on this central square in Tbilisi, you can put into prison, and several hundreds of people already in prison. So. Why I'm mentioning Georgia? Because in 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, people in Eastern Europe were saying it's not about South Ossetia and Abkhazia only. It's about the bigger things. Russia is testing.
It's not about those two regions which were taken from by the Russians, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It's more.
Yeah. It's not about like Russia really cannot imagine itself without these two regions. No. It's the same with Ukraine. It's not about like people in Kremlin are sitting and saying no Russia is possible without Bakhmut, or no Russia is possible without Mariupol. Of course, they're thinking in a wider terms, and I think one of the models of the world that they want to break is the model where empires cease to exist. And if we look at the European history, right, we can look at the history of de-imperialization. We can see how United States war for independence was also an anti-colonial or anti-imperial war. We can see that independence of the Latin American countries. We can see then the collapse of the Central European and Central and Southern European empires after the First World War. And interestingly, Russia collapsed several times as an empire. We can say early 20th century, late 20th century, but it succeeded to re-establish itself. And I think that contrary to other empires, contrary to German Empire, for example, contrary to French Empire, to British Empire, and I think that they have this kind of thinking that, look, other empires can collapse, and this is in their mythology, which comes from the early 16th century. This idea of Third Rome. This idea that other empires can collapse. The first
Moscow as the third Rome.
Yeah, Moscow as the third
after
Rome.
After Byzantium is Constantinople, and then Moscow.
Yeah.
And so being an empire.
Yeah, yeah. And other empires can collapse, but not the Russian one. And I think this is very important to understand what is happening now, because for Putin, there are several model figures in the Russian history. One of them is Stalin. Contrary to Lenin, by the way. I can explain why. Another one is Peter I, another one is Catherine II. And what he's now doing is basically the coming back of the Catherine II plan to capture the northern Black Sea region. But then there is Peter. And Peter, who was very inspired by the Dutch Marine and Dutch fleet. But basically what Peter I did in the early 18th century, he brought this Russian Empire into Europe. And I'm always saying, guys, the Baltics are really in trouble, and Russia can think about attacking the Baltics, because it's in this idea that Russia can be an empire only when it connects the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. And if this is true, if this hypothesis is true, then NATO and EU should be very worried.
And don't forget that the great Russian rival in that era was Sweden, so.
Scandinavia.
Scandinavia.
Sweden as being the hegemon in the whole Scandinavian era, but the Baltics. So you're saying now he's maybe pushing the Catherine II example or agenda, and he might start doing that. With Peter the Great.
But the game is much wider. The game is, as Anne said, well, we started like liberals, especially after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, started to think that liberal democracy is a norm and autocracies and empires is a deviation.
Yeah.
Well, Putin thinks that empires and autocracies is a norm and democracy is a deviation. And he really thinks that history.
And in the light of history, as Anne just pointed out, if you look at the amount of time people were under autocracy, he's right.
He's not right, but
Thank you.
No. But I mean, that doesn't mean that we should not take his ideas seriously. And this is very important. Therefore, we should study. We should study the thinking behind Putin. We should study the thinking behind Xi Jinping. We should study the thinking behind Trump. We should take it very seriously. This neo-autocratic or neo-imperialist turn, the re-imperialization of the world. We can describe what is happening as re-imperialization of the world. Yeah. The idea of the empire becomes popular again.
And why is he not right? Because it is indeed very often that empires exist for centuries over big parts of the earth. So why is he not right?
He's not right because I still believe that we will live for a long time and that history is not ended, and we'll have a big amount of history in the future. But it doesn't, what today is happening is also a very important thing. What is happening today is collapse of the old idea that capitalism brings democracy and democracy brings capitalism. So we have the idea of China saying that autocracy brings capitalism and autocracy brings welfare.
So we're seeing the end of the Weber thesis.
Sorry?
The end of Max Weber's idea of capitalism and democracy. Intertwined.
I'm not sure that Max Weber was right with his Protestant ethic, but I mean, I'm saying that
people from non-Protestant countries tend to not like
but Americans and Dutch tend to think
the Ukrainian Greek Catholics tend to not like this Max Weber. Yeah, but I think it's a very important thing to understand that. That like the good things that people had about democracy, that is bringing welfare, are also now in doubt. And that means that democracy is losing a little bit the fight for hearts and minds. Therefore, in reinventing democracy is very important. And the role of Ukraine, where democracy is taking, why this democratic idea is still very important in Ukraine, in countries like Ukraine, because people know what it means to live in autocracies. People know what it means to live in tyrannies. And not just 20 years ago or 30 years ago, 40 years ago, like in Poland or in some other countries. People know from their family members in the occupied territories that when Russian army enters the territory, the first thing they create is the torture chambers. And they show where the torture chambers are. And the torture is also for the Russian army is not a way to get information, is a way to show who is the boss, who has power and who has violence. People know what it is. And I think this, in Ukrainian, in Polish also, I think we have this word nevola, which is unfreedom. And we know what nevola means. We know what unfreedom means, and therefore we are struggling to get this vola, to get this freedom. And if you look at the classics of political philosophy, starting from Plato and Aristotle, they will also say that democracies are strong when people still remember the alternative.
And this idea of empire, you've written a lot about the Russian or Soviet empire. To me, it's still very puzzling how the Russians managed to get away with their imperialism for so long, and it's not being recognized in Europe, especially not, but also not in America, as an imperialist power.
Because we were, like all civilizations, we are very narcissistic. And we are interested in our own imperial history, and our imperial history was about, certainly here and certainly in Britain or in France, our imperial history was about going out to other continents and repressing people there and extracting wealth from those places and bringing them back. And that's the model. When we say empire and imperial, that's what we think of.
Yeah.
And the victims
we think of the Dutch and the British.
We think of the Dutch in Indonesia, or the British in India, or the French everywhere, pretty much. No, it was a joke. In Africa,
Indochina,
Tahiti, and the idea of a land empire, which is what Russia was, both Imperial Russia and then the Soviet Union, that it was a land empire that colonized its neighbors. This is something for reasons that are harder for us to imagine. The Russians themselves always thought about Ukraine that way and always wrote about it that way, and going back to the to the 17th, 18th centuries, and then a different concept for Poland. And there was a, it doesn't matter. There was a kind of vassal.
Is unsurmountable difference. You will always be different. You will never become the same as me. While for land empires, especially for the Russian Empire with regard to Ukrainians and Belarusians, the logic is different. You are the same as me. You will never become different than me. And your sameness is expressed in language. And therefore language, and not race, is the whole history of Russification, the imposing of the Russian language, because the whole history of Russification, the imposing of the Russian language, because language is the only thing that puts, this big empire together. It's not religion, by the way, because Russian Empire has Muslims, has Buddhists, and all the rest. So therefore, we underestimate the role of the language that played in the Russian imperial history in the same way as the role of race played in French imperial history, or British imperial history, or Nazi imperial history. And the second difference, I think it's also very important that people also misunderstand, is that Western empires were mostly driven by capitalism and driven by companies, right? Yeah. And they were first this very economic wealth extraction, etc. While Russian imperialism was different. It was all about identity first, and then economics, and even during the Soviet Empire. So, if we describe the Russian imperialism and then Soviet imperialism in the leftist terms, we kind of miss something very important. And coming back to Poland, if you read what Russian nationalists imperial nationalists were writing about Poland in early 19th century, even the classics of the Russian literature like Pushkin and his famous poem To the Slanderers of Russia, which was a reaction to the Polish uprisings. And if you compare to the current discourse with regard to Ukrainians, it's pretty much the same. Because what people were saying at that time is like, don't interfere in our affairs. The way how we kind of punish Poles for their insurrections is our affairs. It's how we Slavic people
internal affairs.
Internal affairs. It's not your idea, and it's not what you should care about. You meaning the Brits or the French, etc. And it's really kind of there is a parallel. What Poles were for Russians in the 19th century, Ukrainians are now.
Because, and that's not very well known, amazingly, because you're subjugating Ukraine through Russification, but also through starvation. You wrote a whole book on the Red Famine, your book from 2017, I think. Is that sort of episodes where millions of people were starved to death, Ukrainian people, is that part of that subjugation, or is that just part of industrialization of the Soviet Union?
No, so the Ukrainian famine there was a larger famine in the Soviet Union. There was a period of famine that followed collectivization, and the collectivization, for those of you blessedly too young to know what I'm talking about, was the state takeover of farms. So actually after the Russian Revolution, after the Communist Revolution, there were still a lot of private farms all over the country. That was one of the last things that they made part of the state, and they collectivized them. And there was tremendous resistance to collectivization from both in Russia and in Ukraine, actually, and elsewhere in Kazakhstan and other places. There was resistance from people who were just experiencing having their land taken away, or their cows marched off to a collective space, or losing their farm implements, and so there was a lot of resistance. And one of the first things that happened following collectivization was that the agriculture sector was destroyed. People were unable to produce, and there was immediately a kind of nationwide famine all over the Soviet Union. Yeah. What happens if
you could look at this as a problem of collectivization?
So that was
and
it was that it was to start with. However, Stalin, during this period of famine, as it began, because it takes place over 3 or 4 years, Stalin uses this moment. 1932, 33.
Yeah.
Stalin understands that the famine is happening. And he uses this moment to focus especially on Ukraine. And this is documented in my book, and I
know, we should read it, yeah.
You should all read it, that's right. and it's in Dutch. And he uses this moment partly because the resistance to collectivization was very, very strong in Ukraine, so much so that there were even some armed incidents. There were sort of people who got their weapons out that had been in the barns from the Civil War, and they shot party, apparatchiks who'd come to their villages to collectivize the town. So there was armed resistance, there was real resistance, especially in Ukraine, and especially in parts of Ukraine that had been that had resisted the Bolsheviks before, because the Bolsheviks had only recently conquered Ukraine and they had not fully absorbed it. And there had been still a lot of tolerance for the Ukrainian language, and Ukrainian culture was actually allowed to exist in the 1920s. And then what happened was there was a huge revolt in Ukraine at exactly this moment. Stalin sees these horrified messages from Ukraine. And there's then a series of decrees that are passed that are specifically about Ukraine, about harshening instead of helping with the famine, they made it harsher. And so there were a whole series of things that happened. There were specific places that were targeted. There were the borders of Ukraine were shut off so that people wouldn't be allowed to leave. And there were a number of things targeted at Ukraine, which were designed to make the famine there worse.
And then millions of people starved.
Sorry?
Millions of people starved.
And then you have, the best number we have is between 3 and 4 million.
3 and 4 million?
Yes, who starved, at that time, over that period of time, and the numbers are notably very high in parts of Ukraine that had not suffered famine before, because there are parts of Ukraine, especially in the south, that had been subject to famine.
Unimaginable suffering. I mean, you describe it in your book, but millions of people starving, and starving is sort of a particularly harsh way of dying.
It's a very hard thing to write about, because even when you write about you have my Gulag book there. I mean, even when you write about people in camps, there are memoirs from the camps. There were people had ways of surviving. There's some kind of life that goes on. I found actually writing about the Ukrainian famine was much worse than writing about the Gulag, because it's really a story of very poor people starving to death. And there's really not that much, in your conversation about darkness and light, it's very hard to find any positive lessons or anything that anybody learns from that. And one of the things that happens immediately after the famine and kind of concurrent with it is that then Stalin also begins this crackdown on Ukrainian culture, on the Ukrainian language. They ban a Ukrainian dictionary. They shut Ukrainian theaters. They take down some buildings in Kiev. Actually, they even destroy the Ukrainian Communist Party, which prior to that had some independence. It was a little bit different. So the famine is then the beginning of this kind of Gleichschaltung, this kind of destruction of Ukrainian culture that then continues. And then, of course, there's a phenomenon of, in some of the empty spaces in Ukraine, Russians move in, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, but it becomes part of the Russification of Ukraine.
Is that still, does that famine, the Red Famine, and I believe in Ukrainian you call it Holodomor, is that still playing out in what we're seeing today in the war?
Yeah.
Because this is something which might be very logical for you, but I think in Western Europe it's something which totally is not taken into account into what we're seeing today.
First thing I would like to add, and really advise to read Anne's book, it was also very, very welcome in Ukraine, that Ukraine indeed has a very fertile land. And if you travel to some of the regions, and for example, lots of current fighting is going on in the most fertile lands on earth. And if you go there, for example, last year we went to one of the villages that is now occupied, and I was so impressed because I live in the Kiev region, but in that village, the earth is like this. It's really dark. It's really black.
Yeah.
It's really black, and it's
it's sometimes more than a meter.
So to organize such a famine, you need to really work hard because people have a lot of food and there is a big, food culture in Ukraine. So this is one thing. Another thing is that Ukrainian, of course, peasant culture is very, very much, it's very botanical. It's very, people make songs about plants and about bread and about grain, and it's very embedded into the culture. People make embroidery shirts with this botanical and plant elements. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very important. And as if the Holodomor is also as if you take one's essence out of this. So you take away something which is the most important for you, the kind of makes what you really are. And another element I think is very important is that really to understand Ukraine, you need to really understand that all this resistance to the Russian rule, which comes from 19th century to the 20th century, 21st century, doesn't only come from, let's say, elite class or aristocracy. It comes really from a very deep layers of society, of what we really can call people and a nation. And why is that? Because this instinct of freedom is very, very much embedded. I think that makes a big difference with Russians, because in Russian political nation, if it exists, there is a big difference between the elite, which you have this freedom-seeking element in the Russian elite starting from the 19th century up until now, but it's not supported with the national instinct, with the deep instincts of the people. Whereas in Ukraine it is. And Anne is talking about the peasant revolts. I mean, you need to have a real motivation and real energy to organize peasant revolts. And there were lots of them, indeed, in the 1920s and 1930s. Why is that? Because collectivization was aimed to destroy this freedom, economic freedom, because Ukrainian farmers are very individualistic, and they would love to have their own economic oikos, as the Greeks said, right? Their own households. And this destruction of this individual spirit of individual farming and individual thinking in everything which is individual was one of the aims, I think, of Stalin, because Stalin understood that he needs that collectivization is a way to erase this individuality from the peasants. And then what later came, it was immediately this destruction of intelligentsia, Ukrainian intelligentsia. It's the same years, it's in the early 1930s. And for example, one of the icons of the Ukrainian culture at the time, Mykola Khviliovy, who is the leader of this left-wing Ukrainian culture in Kharkiv, and really the cult figure, he shot himself in May 1933, but he shot himself after making a trip to several villages with his friend, which was struck by Holodomor. So it was so there were some other reasons for his suicide, but I think it's one of the examples what happened, and then all this generation were just exterminated, put into gulags, and then exterminated by 1937. So why it is important today? Because today we have the same practices with some of the village people we talked to who went through occupation. In Kharkiv Oblast, we talked to a woman who was telling us that Russians would encircle a village and will not allow any go through. So basically,
anybody to go out.
Shops are no longer working. Yeah, right, and you cannot find food anymore. You cannot find food which is brought to you by cars or something, and it lasts for 3 months. It lasts for 4 months. And this is what was happening during Holodomor, that not only they took all the food, but they encircled village and the villages and not allowing people to leave the village or to bring some food there. And this time, the peasants we talked to, they were saved. Why? Because they had savings, the food savings. Well, usually Ukrainian peasants have a lot of food savings in their cellars, in the underground. But so these food savings were not confiscated, contrary to what happened.
Yeah, I should have said during the Holodomor, there were teams of activists who went from house to house and destroyed food. They would take it or take it away. They would search for it. They would look for where it was hidden, and they would remove it.
So this is the only difference, but all other practices are also very, very similar.
Mm-hmm.
Can I add two other points that might be useful? One is that this kind of Stalin and then later really Soviet obsession with destroying anything independent, so independent small businesses, independent organizations, independent institutions. This is something that you can find in modern autocracies. I mean, many now try to do it without this mass murder and this mass blood because that has bad effects. But Putin is also obsessed with making sure that there are no independent organizations, art groups, businesses who are able to exist independent of the state. So this idea that we rule without any opponents or any opposition. I mean, again, I don't like making exact comparisons or parallels because things are different now than they were. But this idea, which is was quite deep in Soviet culture, you can see it reappearing again in Putin and Putinism, and which is not very surprising because he was a functionary who was brought up in Soviet culture and trained in it, and this is how he was educated. And one other thing I should have said about Stalin is Stalin very explicitly says at one point in one of his passages, he talks about British colonialism and how the British, or he imagines that Britain became rich because it stole from its colonies, which isn't actually what happened, but that's how he imagined it. And he talks about, we don't have colonies, but we have the peasantry. We can take from the peasantry, and that's how we will enrich ourselves. So he did have this idea, not just of colonizing Ukraine, but of colonizing the countryside in more ways. So he also thought, he made an explicit comparison of what he was doing to colonialism.
You both pointed to the fact that you cannot really understand Russian society and what's happening actually at the front in Ukraine if you don't take into account sort of the history of the Gulag and the history of prisons and the role prisons played in the history of Russia in the 20th century and even before that. And you wrote this book, The Gulag, A History, and you pointed to and also you just mentioned the first thing they do is opening up torture rooms and making known that they are there, which is partly to terrorize, but it's difficult to understand maybe if you don't take into account sort of the history of incarceration and of gulags in the Soviet Union.
I mean, for me, one of the weirdest things that's happened to me in my life is that I wrote these books. I wrote about the Gulag. I wrote another book about the Sovietization of Eastern Europe after the war, and I thought I was writing books about the distant past. They were of interest to historians and so on. And one of the things that's happened in recent years is that you see actually repetition of almost exactly the same things happening again. I mean, what the Soviet Union did in occupied Poland in 1944 and 1945, or occupied East Germany, is almost exactly what Putin is doing in occupied Ukraine now. I mean, it's the same mentality and the same tactics and creating the same kinds of prisons and with the same purpose. I mean, it's very. I actually happen to know that there are KGB playbooks. I mean, they kept records of their own past activities because I've seen them in archives. And I have no doubt that someone got out those old records and looked at them again. How do we, when they moved into Crimea in 2014, this was like I watched it with, jaw dropped, oh my goodness, I know exactly what they're doing because that's what they did in Poland, in Eastern Poland after the war, with the guys in the fake uniforms and pretending to be something else.
Which is now Western Ukrainian territory, but the same places, yeah.
Well, no, this was actually even further west. This is what's now Poland, because there was something slightly different that happened in what had been Eastern Poland and is now Western Ukraine, but this is in Lublin and so on. Mm-hmm. And it was exactly the same thing, So, I mean, it was like for me, it was even very, I watched it and thought, oh, I missed that. I should have emphasized more that they cooperate with the criminal classes because that's what they did in Crimea. And I thought about it. I didn't really emphasize that enough. I'd already written the book by then. And I thought, oh, I missed this I missed this aspect of it. I see what they're doing, and I should have emphasized this more. But it was for me incredible. I mean, it was so obvious that it was the same story and it was the same playbook, exactly. And then I was surrounded by, I was living in London at that point, and I was surrounded by BBC journalists who I would be on television programs, and they'd say, well, what do you think is happening? Who are these green men? Are they Ukrainian separatists?
On the Crimea.
This is the Crimean invasion in 2014. And I said, no. I knew exactly who they were, but it was hard to convince people. Yeah. I mean, these tactics of hiding what they're doing and pretending that they're sending in, it's not clear what the nationality of people are, and wearing uniforms without markings and so on. None of this is new. I mean, they'd done it before.
Look, I think what Russia is trying to do is to say that there is no history, that there is no progress, there is no moral progress, that we can repeat. That's one of the slogans, right? We can repeat. So the European slogan after the Second World War is Never again. Yeah. Let's not repeat the atrocities. I think what Russians are telling to all of us right now, that we can repeat all these atrocities. And look, we've talked with one man who was tortured in one of the villages of Kharkiv Oblast. And when he was tortured with electric current, he said that his torturers were saying, so they were calling this torture, which is very painful, which is worse than beating. The torturers were calling it, let's make a phone call to Putin. And then we asked several other human rights defenders, and we understood that this is a systematic, so it's not a single case. So I was thinking, what does it mean when a torturer tortures another person and he says, let's make a phone call to Putin? So he makes a direct connection of violence, this vertical of violence between what he's doing, as if it's not me who is doing that. It's actually Putin who is doing that with all of you, and I'm part of this big infernal machine. And I think it's very important because I recently called this regime in Russia a regime of Thanatocracy, which means the rule by death.
Thanatos is the Greek word of death.
Yeah, Thanatos is. And it's not a metaphor, because I think what we miss in understanding.
It's not a metaphor. It's a description.
Yeah, I think what we miss in understanding of Stalinism is the idea. Well, some people describe all these purges as some paranoid actions, whatever. I think what was happening is that Stalin wanted to show a message that I owe your death, and I will decide when you will die. When you will die. And when you send this message to society, everybody is afraid. Everybody is frightened, because people think that their death will be natural, that the death is the most intimate thing that they have. And when there is somebody who owns your death, who possesses your death, it's really frightening. I mean, that creates this climate of fear, of total fear, when people actually, because tyrants actually rule by fear, right? We know that from old classics of political philosophy, but in order to produce this fear, you need to produce it in industrial scale. And in order to produce it in industrial scale, you need to persuade everybody that the tyrant actually owns your death and can decide when a person will die. I think that what is happening with Putinism is pretty much the same, because he gives Russian citizens a great amount of freedom, of course. You're free to choose how to die. That's what he's saying. You can die in your village as an alcoholic. That's what he said. It's not me who is inventing that.
That's what he literally
said.
Yeah.
You can die as an alcoholic in your village, or you can die in the Russian army in these stupid attacks, stupid actually suicide attacks that Russians are doing all the time on Ukrainian forces. I would like just to mention today.
You're saying that these waves of soldiers, meat waves, they've been called, that it's a purpose. It's a purpose in his idea of Thanatocracy, that it shows his population that he owns your death.
I think yes. I think that in this tyrannical worldview, you are respected only when you basically manage and possess the death of others. That's when you show that you are able of extreme violence, then you're respected as a tyrant. And I think this describes why, for example, some people say, so why people loved Stalin, why people were crying when Stalin was dead in 1953. And my response is that, look, does it mean they trusted him so much? My response is that, well, the regime by that time exterminated all the subjectivity, all the sense of freedom. And when you exterminate all the subjectivity of people, then your subjectivity, your freedom only depends on the tyrant, if he exists or not. So you're unfree unless you're governed by this tyrant. And I think this is what's happening a little bit in Russia today.
And so it's not, it's fear, it's not trust. So they don't trust Putin, they fear him, because trust is the...
Well, I think they fear and respect at the same time, and this is kind of combination between the two. One last thing I wanted to say.
Please.
Today is a very important day because 27th of June, 2 years ago, our friend and great Ukrainian writer Victoria Amelina was in a restaurant in Kramatorsk, and there was a missile strike, and that killed her. Well, she died a few days later. Now there is her book, Looking at Women, Looking at War, which is in many languages. I really advise you to read. I don't know whether it exists in Dutch as well, but it's very important that we remember her. It's exactly 2 years ago that we remember all the people who lost their lives in this war, both soldiers and civilians. But I would like also to direct your attention why she was killed. She was just sitting in the restaurant in Kramatorsk. That place we have been several times before. I know this place very well. Yes, it was the place of crowded of people because lots of people coming. It was a good place to eat, and the Russians just sent a missile there. So why would you send a missile to a crowd of people? And this is what's happening all on and on and on and on again. They're sending missiles to the crowds of people. They don't care if it's civilians, military. They really proceed with this sending as much death as you can so that people get broken.
Get killed, yeah.
And also so because they want it to have a mental effect as well. It's not just people being killed, it's also about creating this sense of fear and anxiety.
Maybe moving to still the same subject, of course, Ukraine and its war but if you look at the map of the Soviet Union, only a few countries managed to break away, and the Baltics are a good example. And we thought maybe for a while the Georgians were, but inside sort of the core of what was left of the Russian Empire, the Ukrainians managed to sort of break away from that tradition, from, signs of stop the corruption by the crowds, a call for democracy, and now 3 years and even 14 years of armed resistance to the colonizer. I mean, how come, what might be a reason why Ukraine managed to do that, Ukrainian society? Is there something different from the Central Asians, or is that something, lies that maybe in sort of the history of suppression, the Red Famine, or how would we look upon that? How Ukrainians managed to sort of break the sort of hold of the Russians? After from Catherine II onwards, it was...
I think we need to look at Ukrainian struggle as a part of a very big picture. And I think we described it a little bit with Anne because it's a global history. It's not a history of Eastern Europe. It's a history what kind of the world we will have in the 21st century. Will it be the world of tyrannies, of autocracies, Inc., of empires, or it will be a world of more or less republics and democracies? You all know that we have now a new authoritarian wave all over the world, right? But when we look at Eurasia, right, and Russia wants to call itself Eurasia, Ukraine is probably the brightest case, but still one of the many. And And I think that there is so much potential that so many, nationalities, cultures that were subjugated by Russia, they have own culture, they have own language, they have own religion. We're talking about Republic of Sakha, we are talking about, Tatarstan, we are talking about Buryatia, we're talking about Tiva, we're talking about the Caucasian nations. All this history of oppression, Russia is very much afraid that Ukraine wins, because it will mean the domino effect on all other nations and all other cultures. On your question, why Ukraine succeeds, because I do think that there is a profound difference of political cultures between Ukraine and Russia, because Ukrainian political culture, and it goes well, deep into the centuries. It's much more decentralized. It's much more focused on what Ukrainians are called hromada, meaning the community. It has much more this freedom-loving, even anarchic spirit. And there were some problems with nation building, probably because of that. But yeah, Russian rule, which actually, became so much present only by the late 18th century. But then if you take all the other centuries, goes much deeper and deeper. I think this is what now pops up. And there is a big amount of this equality and freedom and democracy inside all this multi-century history of Ukraine.
I think there is something also about the fact that Ukraine was a colony, or a kind of colony, and that therefore the organization in Ukraine is almost always grassroots and also almost always kind of against the state, which sometimes works for them and sometimes doesn't. Because what very often happened in Ukrainian history, as elsewhere, was the elites would become Russified and become part of the empire, and then to be Ukrainian was to be something different. And so you had this tradition of civic organization, grassroots organization, and this turned out to be, particularly in the context of this war, very important. I know that from we have a colleague who's one of the great Ukrainian journalists, Natalia Gumenyuk, who has a lot of stories about going to Ukrainian villages. And she went to a lot of villages that had been liberated after being occupied. This is after there was a wave of liberation at the end of 2022. And she, by talking to people, she would learn the story. And one of the things that always confused the Russian occupiers was the fact that in these Ukrainian small towns and villages, there would be a mayor. And the mayor would be somebody who had legitimate support. Like, he would be somebody who was voted for by local people, and he would have the authority to organize whatever, food distribution or medical supplies or something. And the Russians were always confused by that because they don't have this tradition of there being real local leaders who have been elected by local people, because in their case it would be someone appointed by Moscow or someone who came from outside and who wouldn't have that kind of authority. So you have this kind of ground up authority and as I said, sometimes it works against the Ukrainians. I mean, Ukraine has actually, since the 1990s, has very often had a very weak state. And that's because there's no tradition of having a state. There's a tradition of grassroots organization and local movements and civil society, but there isn't a state tradition. People are always skeptical and suspicious of the state. And that was one of the reasons it often became corrupt. But in the current situation, in the current context, it's served them very well. And I mean, the Ukrainian army, this is a very long subject, is also, even now, organized very different from the way a Western army, certainly the American army, is organized. So instead of being a big hierarchy and everybody reports up to the leader, I mean, there's, of course, that exists and there is a hierarchy, but there are also these units that have their own independent status that have been sometimes created by someone who has a particular authority in a local place, and maybe he has his own funding from somewhere, and there's even some, they have their own ways of raising money for drones or for cars or whatever else. And that idea of a somewhat decentralized army, I mean, it's almost like a combination of a of a modern army and a kind of insurrectionist, revolutionary army. I mean, it has both faces, which could also turn out to be a problem at some later moment. But I mean, it's both. It's often the strength of Ukraine in certain situations, and sometimes it's, as I say, it's a problem.
And I would add something. So we have this proverb in Ukrainian. So 80% of the villagers have gone. He stayed with the 20%, and when we asked him, so why did? And it's like the battle. But emotions that they have, negative emotions they have, is about two things. The first is their leaders. They hate the command of the army, and they're talking about how bad the command is, etc. And they hate the units who is to the left and to the right. So they're thinking they're bad Renaissance, etc. Russians take this and they scale it up. So they make much more quantity. And Ukrainians are producing, there are hundreds, or I don't know.
A friend of mine said in this group, they always try to cheat, they want to be ahead. But there is actually, they've used this competition as a way of increasing efficiency.
Volodymyr is saying, and that's just, he just sort of by mentioned it, but we don't know which system in the end will work. And that's a very ominous sentence, of course, although you sort of said it in an upbeat way, maybe, but that's Autocracy Inc. Helping or being part of that problem. To what extent would you say that our parts of Autocracy Inc., our Western parts, are involved in?
So it's very clear to me that it's really the wrong way. I say this over and over again, but people have this idea that we're having a new Cold War, and everybody wants to say Cold War 2.0, but this is not the way to think about the world. There is no Berlin Wall with like good guys on one side and bad guys on the other. That's not how it works. What there is rather a competition of ideas, and I would also say of practices. And you can find both of them everywhere. And so the allowed shell companies and anonymous money to penetrate all of our societies, allowing shell companies to buy property. I mean, central London is full
Not Shell, the oil company, but Shells as
Shell companies, meaning companies that are owned anonymously. We don't know who really owns them.
Yeah, exactly.
I wasn't insulting Royal Dutch Shell.
No. I'm happy.
Sorry. So we have the phenomenon of anonymous property. We don't know who owns the property. I mean, and this was Trump's business model for many years. About 20 are offshore islands or companies or tax havens. That's just one example. Trade with China or trade with Russia is more complicated. I mean, some of it, I don't know if we buy toys from China, if that's increasing kleptocracy, but there are ways in which Western companies were convinced to go along with projects that have been very important for the construction of the Chinese state. And then, of course, there's the whole story of pipelines. Going back to the 1970s, the construction of pipelines between Western Europe and the Soviet Union, which eventually became a mostly German-Russian project, the insistence on keeping them, the dependence that was created around them, the enormous amount of money that went into promoting them and convincing European governments that this was the best source of energy. Including money spent on cultural projects by the Russians and buying football teams and so on. There was an enormous effort went into preserving that. And some of it was Russian and some of it was Western companies who had an interest in it. Until it turned out that was a very, in fact, unreliable source of energy. And then, we were all in trouble and we had to rethink where our energy came from. But that's an example of a way in which we became it was, even as we understood, even in the years when Putin had begun, after he had attacked Georgia, after he'd attacked Ukraine the first time in 2014, these pipelines were allowed to go on, even though we also understood that was a way of helping Putin remain in power. So, there have been as I say, both the competition of ideas that takes place inside our societies, but also the ways in which we allowed our economic institutions and financial institutions to prop up autocrats. That's also part of the story.
Yeah, yeah. Particularly even on a very personal scale, the current president of the United States doing business in that manner and with those people.
And this is, by the way, I mean, I'm not saying something that's remotely conspiratorial. I mean, it's been proven over and over again and written about multiple times. It's not a big secret. It's very well understood. That was his business model of his real estate company.
So looking forward, and maybe in that respect, ending with the opening of Andrey Kurkov, where he says, you know, and he wrote already more than 2 years.
Especially recently after the last US election. There is no evidence of any kind that the Russians would agree to that. They have never said, if you let us keep Crimea, we'll leave you alone. They've never said, it is literally something that is imagined by people who work at think tanks in Washington. I mean, the Russians have never said they would do that. And so I'm a little mystified still by the fact that people continue to imagine that's how the war will end. I mean, maybe, you know, I can be wrong. Putin can change his mind. He can get tired of the war. I don't know. You know, many things could happen. But until now, until this moment, the Russians have never said that that's how they imagine the war ending. So I would be very careful with that.
So I think that, well, what is happening now? Russians are approaching the borders of the Dnipro Oblast. And that means the oblast of a big city of Dnipro, where we were a few days ago and was shelled recently very heavily. I think they're going to announce that Dnipro Oblast is also theirs. It also belongs to Russia. As you know, Russians have said that 5 Ukrainian regions are now part of Russia, even those territories that Russia does not control. So if we say, okay, Crimea is yours, they will say the next day, okay, but Odessa Oblast is also ours. Odessa city is Russian. Kyiv is Russian, whatever. Dnipro, Kharkiv is Russian. So they will proceed more and more like that, because their aim is not to conquer specific territories. Their aim is conquering, the process of conquering, because Russia is an empire right now that has a center but doesn't have borders. The idea of borders was completely erased from their imagination. And this is how they pronounce it. This is how they formulate it. Putin himself said once that borders of Russia are nowhere. So we speak a lot about Russian disinformation, but I always say that we need to take literally what Russians are saying sometimes. And for example, when they said in 2021 that NATO should go back to the borders of pre-enlargement, pre-90s enlargement, they meant it. They really want to control part of Europe or form a Warsaw Pact, and this is their ambition. This is one thing. The second thing is that what is happening right now, instead of westernization of Russia, we're now having Russification of the West. Through Trump, through far-right parties, through corruption, through this idea that empires is good, etc., etc. And therefore, what is happening in Eastern Europe is so important for Europe itself. One last point, Europe is increasingly in this kind of geopolitical solitude because of the unreliability of the United States, and it's up to Europe to defend itself. It's not only through the attack on the Baltics that Russia will challenge Europe, but also through those processes that Anne described in her book, and through what I would call the possible Russification of Europe through these practices. Therefore, Europe has been built upon this idea of dialogue and conversation. This, I call it AGORA, the model of AGORA. But you have to be able to protect AGORA. You have to have an agon, this Greek word that means ability to fight, in order to protect AGORA. Ukrainians are doing that now. Europeans should join. And they are joining, but gradually. But you also need to understand that this is not a distant war. This is also a war against you, because this is how Russia formulates it.
It's not a distant war. Huh? It's not.
It's not.
No.
It's not a distant war. It's a war against Europe. It's a war against many things, actually. But certainly Russia would love to see European Union collapse and love to see European Union disintegrating into small states which are very easy to colonize, which are very easy to manipulate.
Should we be, to end the last question, should we be happy, and did it sort of end very well? Because, you know, the last days we had 5%, everybody in the NATO here in The Hague, yesterday and today before, Tuesday and Wednesday agreed on 5% more. Even Trump sort of played along. Is this sort of the happy ending of it all?
I mean, it's a happy ending in rhetoric, but it's not yet the happy ending in reality. So let's see whether people actually change their economies and change their investments and pay attention to the way the war is being fought in Ukraine, because that's the future of warfare. And I don't see that that's happened yet.
It's not always the question of money, because, for example, Russians are using a lot of cheap weapons. It's a question how you adapt to reality on the front line. What exactly do you produce? How much, in which quantities? Does it need it by specific units? Because the war is changing very, very quickly. Like every 3-4 months, we have something new appearing. Now Russians are attacking Ukrainians with these wire drones, so the drones that have cables, and therefore, these cables can, you know, reach dozens of kilometers. But it will probably change in 3 months. So it's important how much we spend together, but also it's also important how quick we are, how adaptable we are, because we cannot plan something to produce in 3 years. Probably in 3 years you will not need it, because the reality is changing so much. So the problem of Europe is not only this feeling in itself as a kind of a matrix, as I said, this kind of an unreal world of welfare, which in prosperity, which disappears. I really advise you to read the great Stefan Zweig book, The World of Yesterday, where he describes this feeling of stability, everything is fine, but then the First World War comes. But it's important the speed is also important. Not only the money or the engagement, but the speed of production, the speed of adaptability, the speed of, and therefore, of course, yeah, I agree that.
I mean, and also this 5% number is something that's being said to please Trump. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, what matters is exactly, as Volodymyr says, how the money is spent, when it's done, how serious people are about using it in a real way. I mean, do we need to build a lot more tanks? No, we don't, you know.
Tanks are more and more useless on the front line. This is how the war is changing, because a big tank will be destroyed by 5, 6, 7 drones in 10 minutes. And these drones will be cheap. So, and it's changing. And probably in 1 year we'll be in a completely different reality as well.
And I think, like you just both mentioned, it's also the realization that it's our war and that we are in it more and more alone, because there's no backing up by the United States. There's China. It's more and more our place in the world which we need to defend. I'm looking into the audience to see whether there's a question, and there's back to Iskander. And a question I'd like to remind everybody is a short sort of sentence which has a question mark at the end.
This is not how we spoke.
I wanted it actually to be long, but okay, I'll try to be short. Thank you for mentioning indigenous. I'm Bektur Iskander. I'm from Kyrgyzstan, a country that has been colonized by Russia, unfortunately, for quite a while now. And although we are independent, we are still de facto colonized. And unfortunately, I see that whenever the resistance against Russia is happening from people of color, like us, that is not that much visible in the West. And it includes also indigenous people in Russia right now. And their resistance is also not much visible. What do you think should be changed to build more solidarity links with other, let's say, front lines of possible resistance to Russia? And where is the missing link?
I will try to be very brief. This is what I try to say, saying that Ukraine is not the only example. It's probably one of the most visible, but it also should open up a big story of the Russian imperialism with dozens and dozens of colonized nations. And I think this is through Ukraine. So if you are a scholar, for example, if you're in university, the next big title of research is to study, Russian colonization of Eurasia, and all these peoples and all these nations and all these struggles. It's also very important to connect the lines. Like Anne already mentioned it, there is a connection between the famine in Ukraine and the famine in Kazakhstan, for example. There are differences because the type of peasants Stalin wanted to destroy are different. But we should make this connection. And I think, so Ukrainian story is not okay, there is one rebellion against Russia, we don't know how it will end. It's only the beginning of opening up of this story.
If I may say something, I want to add something what Anne said about this delta system of points. It's also helping a lot because there's not only that they get points who shoots most things, the drone teams, but they also can, the winners can get for free a lot of drones. And it makes the system less corrupt. So it gets out the Soviet system from the army. It's very important. But my question is, we all want Ukraine to win, but what would be the best outcome? What would be your dreamed scenario? I would like to ask you both.
I think that's a good last question, closing off both of question by Jaap Scholte, Dutch writer and organizer of many.
Well, the victory. I don't think we can come to a point when we say, okay, Ukraine wins, Russia loses, everybody goes home, watch Netflix, everything is fine. I don't think we will be on this point anytime because history doesn't end. And our hope is to have a situation when Russia is not able to wage wars. It's up to Russians to decide what size of they will have, etc. I don't think that Russia, in its current size, is able to become a democracy because usually democracies are smaller, more efficient. But But the key thing about victory, and it should be sustained and long-term, is incapacity of Russia to wage wars, incapacity of Russia to invade, incapacity of Russia to exert violence inside its own country. I would define it that way.
I would say that this war will end when there is a political change in Russia, by which I don't necessarily mean regime change. It will end when the Russians themselves understand that the war was a mistake. In other words, when there is national understanding that that it was a wrong turn, it was an error, and they understand that the desire to repeat and recreate the Russian Empire will fail. And that is very often, by the way that colonial wars end. I mean, if you look at the French in Algeria, or you look at the British in India, there comes a moment when the imperial power says, we don't want to do this anymore. And it's hard for me to predict when that will happen or what it will look like, but when it happens, we will know it. And then this war will be over, and a lot of other things will be also over.
I thank you very much. The little announcement the movie said it's not for the faint-hearted. I think some of the things that's been said here are just incredible, touching, and at least for me, sort of unbearable to hear. I thank you very much for sharing that with us and for coming over and sharing your knowledge and insights in it. I'd like to invite you maybe to go and see one of the art pieces in the Filmzaal. In there's film hall. There's a Ukrainian art collective, Open Group, which has an amazing work. This work was also the Polish submission to the Venice Biennale. It's a loop, and you can watch it. You can also look at the Georgian artist Aleftina Kakidze on the stairway up. You can look at Nikita Skravtsov's painting behind me, but also the one he's making now at this moment in the Pleinzaal. There's also the art installation outside on the architrave of Dries Verhoeven. You can see his arm dangling down. So there's art to see, and I hope you come tomorrow maybe to the marathon interview also with Volodymyr Yermolenko. Anne Applebaum now needs to run out to Paris. I'm very grateful for you coming over here from Warsaw. Thank you very much. And there are books to buy outside, actually.